President Biden was wheels up from Saudi Arabia 24 hours ago, and President Putin will be wheels down in Tehran 2 days from now. The White House says it has gathered intelligence that Iran is preparing to provide Russia with hundreds of drones for use in the war in Ukraine. Iran denies this allegation. The big question is, are the new Cold War battle lines being solidified in the Middle East? To understand more about Washington's reset with Riyadh and Moscow's relationship with Tehran, I want to bring in Vali Nasr. Vali is a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a former State Department advisor. Welcome, Vali. First, tell us about this drone business. Is Russia in a kind of tacit alliance with Iran? Is Iran helping the Russians out?
Well, Iran and Russia have had a very strong military and intelligence relationship that goes back to Syria. But this is the first time that we're hearing of a large-scale Iranian military equipment being sold to Russia. So this is a new step, but it really underscores the fact that the relationship between them is strong, and it's mostly in the intelligence and the military field, and it does matter to regional balance of power.
Now, I am struck by one thing. It does suggest that despite all the sanctions, the Iranians are still able to manufacture something as, reasonably sophisticated as high-quality drones.
That's exactly the case. Although we don't know much about these drones and how good they are, but in fact, it's very ironic that it's the White House that is advertising this fact in the Middle East. Maybe they were hoping by lumping Iran and Russia around Ukraine to create a greater dissatisfaction with Iran in Europe. But in the Middle East, the United States is attesting to Iran's technological capability, having weaponry that the Russians would be interested in.
And what about the Biden trip? From your point of view, does it seem like the part of the trip that was intended to solidify a kind of Saudi Arabia, Israel, UAE axis that was pro-American and to a certain extent anti-Iranian, is that dynamic working?
It is not working the way in which United States and Israel would like to portray it, as if that there's a very hard and fast, fault line in the Middle East between Arabs and Iranians. I mean, first of all, Putin's visit to Tehran shows that there are other big powers in the region, and the United States is not the only player, and Russia has very deep relationships around oil and energy with UAE and with Saudi Arabia. Secondly, not all the Arabs that the president met are sold on the idea of lining up against Iran. Egyptians, Jordanians don't have an issue with Iran. Qataris and Omanis are working very hard to make JCPOA work. And even the president himself was not willing to say that JCPOA is dead. And the picture is much more complicated in the sense that UAE and Saudi Arabia are also talking to Iran. UAE is considering reopening its embassy, and the Saudis have been in dialogue with Iran. So this is not quite the Cold War that the president and the Israeli prime minister tried to portray in their joint press conference in Jerusalem. But yes, there is a serious Arab-Iranian issue that is still at play in the region.
But as you say, and I've heard this from other sources in the Middle East as well, the news story is that the Saudis are talking to the Iranians, I think largely through Iraq. The UAE is talking to Iran. There seems to be an effort to create some kind of new modus vivendi between Iran and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states to diffuse the tensions.
That's indeed the case. I mean, the president tried to take credit in his speech in Saudi Arabia that there is now a ceasefire in Yemen. But that ceasefire actually owes a lot to the Iranian-Saudi dialogue that's been ongoing. And it's very clear that the Arabs want protection against Iran, but they don't want the kind of aggressive policies that, for instance, Israel is following with Iran that could risk war. I think they've made a decision that the United States is not going to go to war with Iran. The United States is now focused on Ukraine and on China. And one of the ways of managing Iran is actually to lower the temperature with Iran. This does not mean that peace is in the air, but the Saudis and UAE definitely are interested in a less aggressive posture with Iran. And that's very different from the way the Israelis are pushing for a much more aggressive position against Iran, where the Prime Minister of Israel said we should put credible military options on the table against Iran. I don't think Saudi Arabia and UAE are quite there.
And what about the other kind of great global power these days? China. China has been busy, it buys much of the oil from the Middle East, but it has been busy cultivating relations with these same Gulf states as well, has it not?
It has, and it's also cultivating relations with Turkey and Iran as well. And its relationship actually with the Gulf state is of a nature that makes a tight American-Israeli relationship with these countries problematic. In other words, the Chinese are building the telecom infrastructure in UAE. They are embedded now in some military bases and military systems in UAE. And that makes it very difficult for the United States to sort of think of the Persian Gulf the way it used to be under Bush, Clinton, et cetera, of very sort of pristine American military technology territory. And so it's not just about Iran in this region. It's about how the United States actually makes sure that these Arab countries don't develop sort of porous borders with China and Russia when it comes to technology and military sets of issues.
That's a very complicated new Middle East. I've sometimes called a post-American Middle East. Vali, Nasr, pleasure to have you on.